Hi and welcome. I hope you know that you don't have to move through your life feeling overwhelmed and depleted by the roles that you play. And although I know that that will happen, it's bound to happen. I'm creating this podcast that I'm calling the Breathe in the Sun podcast. And it's meant to be a place where you can explore stories and lessons and conversations that will help you feel reconnected with yourself, to breathe deeply, to take a pause, and to help you find the clarity you need as you navigate life's chaos. I'm your host, Mari Rodriguez, and I am a certified coach. I am a facilitator, and I'm a lifelong seeker of deeply soulful conversations and connection. And today, I am inviting you to this conversation that I'm having with a very dear friend of mine who I will introduce in a moment. And I ask that as you listen, that you take notes, that you ponder on how this relates to you in your life, and that you allow yourself to just be fully present. So I hope this resonates for you, and I thank you for joining me. Today, I am so excited to have a meaningful conversation with someone I deeply admire, Susie Moya. Susie is a mental health therapist and owner of Embrace Corazon Counseling in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood. Her work centers on helping women of Latin American ancestry reclaim their voices and identities, guiding them toward living in full alignment with their values and truth. As a second generation Latina and parent, Susie understands the challenges of breaking cycles and raising the next generation with compassion, patience, and self gratitude. Her powerful perspective on liberation and self discovery makes her the perfect person to dive into today's topic, being enough. Susie, thank you so much for being here today. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on just navigating, right, this journey of enoughness, especially as parents and as women navigating society's pressures. So, welcome.
Thank you for having me, and I'm excited to also be part of this conversation today.
All right, so we're gonna dive in and let's start with a big question because I know probably a lot of people have this on their mind, which is what does enough even mean to you, personally and professionally? What are your thoughts on enough?
So when I think about enough, um, I'm specifically thinking about like what is enough when when it comes to parenting. And I think that that is also, I think it's a layered question. Um, and so I look at the first part of that question, like what to first start off asking yourself, it's a personal question, like asking yourself, what does it mean to be enough? What exactly are you questioning about yourself when you're asking about enough? So for example, are you questioning like, am I am I being supportive of enough to my child? Am I taking care of myself? Am I being enough of a partner? Um, and so then when you ask yourself that, then I think even going deeper, I ask myself deeper, like what exactly, so for instance, when you're thinking about being supportive to a child, to your own child, like what exactly are you questioning about yourself? And do you notice if while you're questioning yourself, do you notice if that's coming from somewhere else?
Mm.
Like, do you notice if that was where you is that coming from comparing yourself to another parent? Is that comparing yourself to your own parent? Is that coming from what you see on TV?
Mm.
Um, and so I always look at like when you're questioning it, what about is it that you're questioning yourself? Because then it can keep going and going, and we may never
Right.
feel like we're enough, like we're never
Yeah.
doing something right. Um, so
Yeah, I would say thank you for that. And I think for me, I've often struggled with this concept of enough, and it was particularly difficult for me when the pandemic hit in 2020. And I found myself feeling like, especially then, I had to play all of these different roles in my day to day, which was to be an employee at the same time that I was also a parent while my kid was like behind me playing, right? while also having to maintain my home, while also having to think about my family and their needs. And so I felt like during that time in particular, I had a lot of pressure play. I think a lot of us did had this pressure placed on us of, oh my gosh, all of our roles are now enmeshed, are now not separate things that we get to do at specific times of the day. But instead, we have to do it all at once. And so I think for me, it made me feel like, okay, I can't be all of these things. I can't allow myself to give in to this pressure because I will find myself not being sane. Like I would just drive
Yeah.
myself to the point of stress and overwhelm to a point where I won't be able to function in any of the roles that I have. So yeah, especially as it came to being a parent and navigating that, I felt like there was this perfectionism and this pressure that we were facing from outside structures of like, this is what it looks like, and I had to follow that formula. So yeah.
No,
Thoughts on
absolutely. I
that?
just want to throw in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to throw out there when you were talking about that, all of that, and even I was thinking about the pandemic. I'm like, oh my goodness, that was a very, um, there was a very intense time. But overall, when you were describing like all the different pieces, that's exhausting and that's
Yeah.
tiring, and it is a lot. And so that's where I was going at. Like the reality is when we're questioning what is enough, we can spiral forever. And like,
Yeah.
am I ever enough? And so I think one of the great things that like as we're having this conversation is to think about like where is that limit? When can you give yourself permission to allow yourself to say, I am doing enough?
Yeah, I love that. So one of the things that, as you know, you and I, right, when we were preparing for this conversation, that came to my mind when we were talking about structure and the pressures that we feel, and how oftentimes we feel a little lost. We feel a little bit like we're disconnected from our own intuitive wisdom, right? And it made me think about, as a Puerto Rican woman, I know you're Mexican, background, right? It, colonization is big in terms of the history of our people, and the impacts of that colonization and how we view our relationships with really everything. It's threaded into everything that we do. And so I decided to do just a little bit of research to really dig into how that has impacted us. And some of the things that came out of that research, specific to like our children and how that process began, was around education and how Indigenous children were taken out of their families, right, their family structures, and they were forced to go into these institutions, where they were forbidden from speaking their native languages, from practicing their traditional customs, from engaging in their cultural, spiritual practices. And they experienced harsh punishments, right, neglect and abuse, during that time. And as it stands today, right, yes, this happened a long time ago, but we're still seeing the impacts of that. And there are two areas that I wanted to highlight for the purpose of our conversation. The first is that cultural loss, right? Many indigenous languages, stories, traditions, traditional knowledge systems have been lost or are endangered. And the second is our intuition and ways of knowing, right? So the suppression of those indigenous peoples left many of them feeling disconnected from their intuitive wisdom, which includes holistic problem solving, storytelling as a learning method, and deeply embodied spiritual practices. And so, the purpose of this conversation and in the work that you do as a therapist, even, right? How do you see or make that connection between colonization and the impacts of that, and how we view our relationship with both our culture and with our children today? Like, what's the connection there for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And when you were talking, one of the, what I was actually thinking about, is my role as a therapist and the work that I do. So a lot of my work is centered in, well, what I specialize in is working with women, specifically women from Latin American ancestry, And a lot of them are parents. And we have these conversations on trusting themselves. Like they're often questioning their knowledge, their expertise, and in different areas, but especially when it comes to like their own lives, their own individual selves, and as parents. These are one of the big conversations that we have about, am I doing enough? Do I know enough? I'm doing things incorrectly. And I think right now, when you were talking about the history of colonization, that is one of the impacts of being told you are wrong. This is
Mm.
how you're supposed to do it. Ignore your own wisdom, ignore your voice.
Yeah.
And part of this work is about recognizing you have a voice and you have knowledge and you have wisdom, you have ancestral wisdom, and follow your intuition. I know you mentioned one of the you highlighted one of the impacts of being around intuition and ways of knowing. Um, though I think as parents, like we joke around like there is no manual. We wish there was a manual. Like when you have a baby, like here's this manual, follow this, follow this guide. Yes, there's tons of books out there, but there's no specific like manual on how to raise a child.
Yeah.
And though there are tips and strategies, and we can go on a list of all those tips and strategies out there and what studies show it and what academia shows it, which is all great, but that's all part of colonization as well. It
Mhm.
comes down to, how are you connecting with your child?
Mm.
Um, trusting that instinct, trusting what are you know best what your needs are.
Mhm.
And as a parent, you also, as a parent of a younger, especially for younger children, like you know what's best for their needs as well. Trust it, follow it.
That's
Um,
such a good point. Because there's the books out there like What to Expect When You're Expecting, right? And you're like, I remember I bought that book and I remember going through it in the beginning and like they had chapters in there of what to expect when your child is 1 to 3 and then 3 to 6 and like all the development milestones. And I hardly did anything that that book suggested because I was like, okay, but everyone is different, right? To your point. And in the work that I do also with my clients, so as a coach, I notice that everyone's looking for this magic formula. They're looking for the answer. They're looking for someone outside of themselves to say, here's how you do it. I'm going to take your hand and I'm going to give you the step-by-step process for how to be happy, right? How to feel satisfied, how to like and I think, like what you mentioned, what we've lost is our own ability to realize that we are individuals and we are unique. Our life experiences, our memories, the interactions that we've had throughout our entire lives, everyone is unique and different. And there is no formula that we can follow. And if we were to follow a formula, it wouldn't feel intuitive. It wouldn't feel always good for us, right? There might be some aspects of that formula that would make us feel like, oh, okay, yeah, that resonates for me. But there's going to be a lot of it that feels stiff and that feels like we're not being flexible, we're not that it feels rigid, right? And so I think a lot of people struggle with that today. A lot of my clients are women as well and come to me saying things like, I work in the corporate world, I feel frustrated, I feel like I'm doing this job but it means nothing, and I have no access to my joy, I have no access to energy, I feel depleted all the time, I feel tired, and I come home to my kids and I feel like I have nothing left to give to my children. I feel like I just want to disconnect and I don't want to feel this way anymore. And so I'm wondering if it's like we're chasing this outside structure, this dream of what it should look like. And then we put all this pressure on ourselves. Oh, we're not operating. Well, why don't I feel happy? Why don't I feel satisfied? And I think there's something about that disconnect. We're not connecting. There's a disconnection, not just between us and our children, but with ourselves, with our own internal voices that tell us this is what you should do now. Like we're not creating space for that to like connect to that voice. Does that make sense?
yeah, that totally makes sense. And so I want to be able to speak to that, and I do want to take a step back to what we were, like I think specifically around like the conversation on like colonization, and then this piece around like silencing ourselves
Yeah.
and focusing too much on like those external pressures. Um, and right now, one of the keywords you said is space. And so I think about like there's
Mm.
space for it all. I think that yes, a lot of those I, I love books. I reference books a lot. So I think there's a lot of knowledge in books. I think that the concern is when we put all of our knowledge into those buckets of like, oh, they know more better than me. And
Mhm.
that's when it comes, I think that's one of the things that colonization, the harms of it taught us that we don't know enough. We don't know anything, that we don't have enough knowledge, that we're not smart enough, to the point that we don't know how to raise our own children.
Mm.
And I think that that's very harmful. I think that again, there's great resources out there. We want to use it as reference, as some guidance, but it shouldn't be in replacement of our own wisdom, of our own intuition.
Yeah.
So quick story with that. I was reflecting on like my own experience when with my husband. So we are parents of a 3-year-old and soon to be 4-year-olds. And when she was an infant, like we downloaded every app that was out there, and he's more so. He had every app. But we both became very hyper focused on it. We're like, oh my goodness, is she meeting every single one of these milestones? Again, great apps that are tied to developmental theories. But it also was pushing us, and it's not the app's fault, but it was a part of us that was coming from the inside that we were pushing away our own knowledge because we
Yeah.
became so dependent on what did the app say? What did this like what is an app telling us to do? And is she not hitting that milestone right now? Like, oh my goodness, now we're failing. Like there's the spiraling that happens. um, and then the question of going back to the core question for today's, topic of are we doing enough? And
Mhm.
so what I really want to highlight for this is again, it's not about ignoring those resources, but how are we uplifting ourselves to be able to bring us to the surface when and as parents and make us the center um of parenting our children.
So how do you do that? And I know we had other topics that we were going to dive into after this conversation, but I feel like you're pointing more towards personal practices or things that people can do to recenter themselves. What suggestions do you have or have you given to others on how they can do that effectively?
Um, so I know I might be jumping a little ahead because I know we're going to talk about values a little bit later, but I
Yeah.
think I do want to insert a piece here about values. I know that for myself, and even I like these conversations that I have with like my husband, like what are our values? What are our individual values? What are our family values? And what values we want to pass on to, in this case, to our daughter?
Mhm.
Um, And when we are spending 30 minutes focused on like an app, is this aligned with our values?
Mm.
Um, so for myself, I know that emotional connection is really big. One of the things I think about um as a Latina parent, but also working in community with the Latino community, we often talk about like what we learn from our older generations, what we learn from our parents. And one of the big things that sticks out is survival. Like parents
Mhm.
are really focused on, do you have clothes? Do you have food? Are you getting a good education? So it was really centered around survival,
Yeah.
which that's important, right? But now I feel like at least for myself is I want to be able to teach. Of course, I want my child to be healthy, and we are meeting her basic needs. But also, how am I connecting with her emotionally? Am I helping her feel heard? Am I validating her own feel? Am I validating her feelings? Um, and that was not taught in those milestone apps, or that is not taught in
Yeah.
the milestone, well, maybe some, but not the ones that we were looking at. So I bring it back to like, what are my values and how am I aligning our practices with those values?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, it reminds me of some of the work that we used to do in corporate world. I worked in an innovation lab, and we would always talk about our mission and our values, and being very intentional and specific around what is it that you value, and how do you want to communicate that to the customer, for example. And so what I'm hearing is like we maybe do that in work that we do, in a business that we create for ourselves, but do we think about it enough when it comes to our family and our family dynamic and how we want to be living our life in our day to day? And how we can't just overlook that either, that we have to be intentional around identifying what those values are so that when we are taking action, we know what's within scope of those values and when we're stepping out of those values. So that's what I hear, just hearing that connection of like prioritize that as well when it comes to family life, being a parent, relationships, right?
For sure. And I want to add on there, like, yes, I am a therapist, but in full transparency, as a parent, I will say I struggle with some of these things. Like,
Yeah.
I would go into my office or have virtual sessions, and I would talk about this. Like, here are some great things to do with your child. It's like, what are your values? And then I go home and I notice, I'm like, am I practicing this? And that's something my
Mm,
mom often names, like, go out and do amazing work, but remember also how are we practicing this at home. So I often hear my mom's
yeah.
voice with that.
Yeah.
Mhm. I used
Oh,
to take it as
beautiful.
criticism, but now I was like, oh, that's some great, that's a consejo, a great
Yeah.
advice there. Like, how am I practicing? And that's practice at home. And it's not self-criticism either. Just I think that's part of our ancestral wisdom. Like that is
Yeah.
coming from my mom, who she likely learned it for someone else. And
Yeah.
so though her exact um piece of advice there may or may not be found in a book, it's part of my culture, it's part of my family.
Right.
And it's just as important as something that I read in a book.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you think about parenting and our children, so I am also a parent to two young women. Women, they're girls, but they're going to be women one day, an 8-year old and an almost 4-year old as well. And it's hard. It's difficult, and that's on the topic of enoughness, like we said, for today. Um, there's a lot of pressure on us to the point to survival. I'm often thinking about the future, and I'm often thinking about what does my children need so that I am equipping them with the skills they need to succeed in the future. Are they developing good habits, right? Are they learning enough in school, in their even in their relationships with their friends? Are they getting along? Are they compromising? Are they like all of these things, right? That I'm constantly thinking about as a parent. Am I doing it right? Am I messing them up? Am I like all this pressure that I feel? But at the end of the day, I thought that this question was really simple, but also powerful for us to think about, which is what do our children really need from us at the end of the day? So I'm going to ask you that. I have some thoughts too, but what do our children really need from us?
That's a great question. So one of the first things that I think about is to feel heard, and to be listened to, which requires also being present with them. Um, so when you were talking again, I'm always thinking about like stories in my own experience. So most recently, um, my daughter, she told me that she described an argument that she got into with one of her peers, at at one of her extracurricular classes. And she told me about several weeks after that class had happened. And so she was describing it. I went into panic mode because it sounds like she went into like this very intense arguments, and there were some words exchanged between these two 3-year-olds. It's like, oh my goodness, what is happening here? Um, and as she was talking, I noticed my thoughts started to disconnect from the present conversation. It was shifting to like, oh my goodness, like when exactly did this happen? Oh my goodness, we didn't talk to the teachers. What are we supposed to do? Like, what is happening? Is she safe? Um, I think all great questions that I there was also space to reflect on afterward. In that moment, she just needed me to hear her out. And though as an adult, I have these perspectives of safety. I'm always thinking about like safety. Um, but in this moment, she's wanted to be heard. And I realized that I was already creating a narrative about her story when she wasn't finished with her story.
Mm.
I was already like full on, like, what is happening? What do we need to do? And she didn't finish her story yet.
Mm.
Um, and at the end, I realized I was like, oh, she actually solved the concern. Like she got the help from a teacher. I don't actually need to do anything at this time. Yes, I want to make sure, like, monitor and continue now. Like this was like um a note for myself, a mental note of like, okay, we want to maybe make sure they're asking more questions after these classes to make sure that she is okay and that we are able to have conversations with other adults to make sure she's kept safe. But in that moment, that did not need to happen. She just needed to be heard and validated. Um, and then I was able at the end, at least able to share, like after she shared, I said, okay, next time this happens, just make sure you tell us immediately and we can talk to the teachers. And she said, okay. And she moved on and started talking about something else.
Yeah.
Where I was like, again, in panic mode. So for myself, it's like really just hearing out. And I also then also think about my own childhood of how many times I did not feel heard. That I
Yeah.
started to share a story and the adult in my life then ran off with a different narrative, or they try to solve my problem when I just wanted to share my story. And
Mm.
I get it. It can come very easy to talk over a child's, especially when we are constantly thinking about like, I need to do something else. Like I need to finish cleaning. I need to finish cooking dinner. I need to get ready for her bath time. And it's like, we need to speed up this conversation. And children at
Yeah.
that age, for myself, I'm thinking about a 3-year-old, it's still building their vocabulary. Their pace of talking might be a little bit slower.
Right.
And so it also requires patience and presence.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was what I was going to say in terms of the biggest, obviously, our children need safety. They need stability, right? They need to feel secure. And so at a base level, you want to be able to provide those things for your children. And I think a lot of us, we live in Chicago, right? Like a lot of us are pretty solid. We have our careers, we've been established. I mean, of course, that's not across the board for everyone, but um, for those of us who have the job, we have a home, we have the safety, we have the even the family and the support that we need. Um, we forget that our children also need our presence. They need to feel, like you said, heard and feel like they matter, like their voice matters, and that they have a safe place to go to when they're dealing with struggle. And sometimes I find myself um, frustrated or worried when my children have struggle because I'm like, I want them to avoid having pain. I want them to avoid having difficulties and challenges. And when things are not perfect, I often feel like, oh my gosh, am I doing something wrong as a parent where they're struggling? And I forget that that is life, right? Like life is hard sometimes and it's gonna have challenges. And the best thing that I can do is let her know, I'm thinking of my 8-year-old, that I'm here for her and that I can slow down enough that I can just be with her and be present, be fully present, not connected to my phone, not distracted by something else that I have to do, but to be really, really present with her and let her know that she matters. And so, yeah, and that feels like a lot of pressure too. Like when we talk about not being enough, like sometimes I do sometimes think to myself, oh my gosh, I'm not doing that enough. And that presents another challenge. And so it's this idea that everything has to be perfect. I have to be doing everything exactly right as a parent. And I cannot make mistakes as a parent. I cannot. And I see someone else doing it right, and I compare myself to them, and I think, oh my gosh, like they have the answers and I don't. And that's the pressure I think that removes the joy that we feel in terms of, how we envisioned our life to be with our children. We're doing all that planning. I'm going to have a child and it's going to be so much fun and so great. It is in the beginning, but then all of these external comparisons that we do stack on top of each other. And so we get to a point where we feel like we're not even enjoying parenthood. All we're doing is, again, that comparison game. So any thoughts on that, on those external pressures and how we navigate, especially as it relates to perfectionism and comparison? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I have several thoughts on it. One, um, it is totally okay to make mistakes. Like if we expect ourselves to raise a human and not make any mistakes, then we are setting ourselves up for failure, even though we are not failing. The other
Mm,
thing, children are human, right? They're human. And as human beings, we are complex humans. And so I think about that, like as a parent, we are raising a human with so many complex layers. Um, and when we're navigating anything with complexities, anything with layers, it is not going to be an easy route. It's going to be challenging. There are definitely, yeah, some very fun aspects of it. But overall, it's okay to make mistakes. The other thing I wanted to add on to there, and I was thinking about the values. I often think about like, what kind of adult do I want to raise? Who do I want my child to become? And I think about accountability. And so I'm going to try to break this down in like a couple of layers. It's like, one is as parents, and I know I'm going, as parents of any child of any age, when they are hurt, when they make a mistake, when something goes left in their life, often, and I know sometimes I do this for myself and I see this with the clients that I work with, we begin to internalize, what did I do wrong? So our
mm,
child's behaviors are a reflection of us as a parent. And I think that's an unfair judgment of us. Yes, there are things that our children are learning from us. Yes, we could do things different. Yes, their behavior could be a reminder, like their behavior can be a mirror of us. And it's a reminder of like, okay, how can I do things differently? But also, as I mentioned, like they're complex humans. They have minds of their own. They're also pulling from other sources and learning from other
mm,
sources,
mm,
especially when they are of school age or in daycare. Um, and so the best that we can do is model for them and teach them and help them to unlearn things they were noticing that we don't want them to learn.
mhm,
Um, Also, I think that it's important though to model for children. So if I am constantly internalizing my child's behavior or mistakes, any level of mistakes as my fault, then am I teaching my child to be accountable for their own behaviors? Because I'm consuming, or I'm saying it's my fault. And so when this child grows up, am I teaching now this child when they are a teenager, a young adult, a full-on adult, to take responsibility for their own behaviors? Or are they now going to constantly blame it on someone else because at a younger age, I taught them anything they did was actually my faults. And I took responsibility. And yes, there is a piece there as parents of minor children. I mean, we are responsible for them. Some of their behaviors is our responsibility. I think there's a whole other layer there. But just in general speaking, I think about like, what is a lesson taught there? And how can I begin to plant that seed of a young age that we are responsible for our behaviors? Um, and
It,
that's, yeah, I did one, but
yeah,
that's so many thoughts there. But go ahead.
no, I feel like, with the spread of um psychology, like therapy terms are now public knowledge, right? People use all of these therapy terms in our day-to-day now, right? Gaslighting, for example, that's a big one, right? So, oh, I have had trauma, or I feel oppressed, or I feel, I don't know, just all sorts of different terms. I wonder if a lot of that has backfired in the sense that it's causing a lot of women in particular to do what you just described, which is to make it about ourselves. We're so connected to these ideas of therapy and healing and the connections of how our actions impact those around us, that now we're over analyzing things, I guess, and over giving ourselves this responsibility of if my child takes some sort of action that I don't approve of, it somehow is because I am a failure as a parent. It somehow has to do with me and my psychology and my thinking and what I've done to my child. And so, like you said, now we have a generation of children who think I don't have to take responsibility because, yeah, I did something wrong. It's your fault somehow because you said you were sorry to me because we're so like quick to, I'm so sorry, my child. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to mess you up. Like you know what? I made a mistake, but I don't know, that's somehow removing their capacity for dealing with difficult emotions, their capacity for self-managing their emotions, their capacity for also understanding that, um, yeah, they have to take responsibility just as much as anyone else does. And I am saying this as a parent who does that a lot. I've noticed that I do that a lot with Nina, my older daughter, who when we get into an argument, I will oftentimes recognize the ways that I messed up in that conversation, and I'll go to her and I'll apologize afterward, which I think we should do, right? We should take responsibility, but I wonder sometimes if I'm doing it to the point where now she's always expecting that any interaction we have, no matter what action she takes, that there's some sort of apology that she should expect from me as a parent. And that might not be the healthiest way for us to interact with each other. So, um, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense in terms of like the connection with like over therapy. I don't know if that's the word, therapizing ourselves, but you know what I'm trying to get at, right?
I definitely do. And for sure, I want to not take away like the power of apologizing. I think it's really important and valuable, especially when thinking about accountability, to apologize to children. I think that children often are not apologized to, and that's part of the
Yeah.
repair work and like breaking cycles. But also, there is something to say about like over apologizing and people pleasing behavior with our children. More likely than not, that is a trauma response. Um, and also, I'm thinking about colonization. Colonization itself is oppressive. And so, yes, a lot of our behavior, especially as um, women of Latin American ancestry, that there is oppression that's in our history. There is trauma that is in our history. And a lot of the work that I do with my clients is before we begin, like as we're beginning, like as they're entering onto their journey of healing or their healing journey, it's important to recognize and acknowledge the harms of their history around oppression, their harms of their history around trauma, and for us to unpack that and to name that. How is that showing up? How did that show up in their childhood? How did that show up in their adolescence? How did that show up in their current life? And how did that show up if they are parents? How's that showing up in their parenting? But then the next layer is that like, how do we want to do different?
Mm.
And so we do that in a gentle way of not to not shift their the impact of their oppression, of their trauma as their fault, but to recognize how it's showing up and how they want to do different in a sense of like, okay, what is in your power? What do you have control over? What would you like to do different now in your life, despite your history? Because if we stay in this cycle of, oh, it's my parents' fault, or it's my Wallow's fault, or it's my like just the terribleness of oppression and trauma, then we're going to stay stuck. So I think there is a way to validate that piece of our history and our identity while also breaking a cycle
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
doing different. And us having this conversation is part of breaking the cycle.
Yeah.
Cycle breakers, it is not an easy thing, but it requires a lot of patience and compassion, but it's also not impossible.
So, on that topic, right, of intergenerational trauma, I know we didn't include this in our outline, but I'm wondering, what would you say is our generation? I'm a millennial, right? You're a millennial. I think we're the same age. Well, when you think about the trauma of our generation. Anything come to mind in terms of what we might be passing down to our children that we're not even aware of?
That's a deep question. That, because I look at as like as generational trauma, but I look at like this ancestral trauma as well. And as I think that when I think about this generational trauma, and generally speaking, as I mentioned earlier, I think about like um my my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, and really focusing on survival in
Yeah.
their own childhood and their own upbringing, feeling like they did not have enough resources. And so as they were raising myself and like our generation, it was really focusing on like resources and not and having enough, but not focusing on to our emotional needs.
Mm.
And so we're not focusing on our emotional needs. And then I think the trauma impact of that is feeling like that we are not enough, feeling that our words don't carry value, feeling that yeah, what we have to say is not important, which impacts the level of confidence, which leads to questioning ourselves and everything that we do. Um, and also and like leads us to also focusing on like I need to constantly be doing something else. Like I need to make sure that my child is perfect because my child is a reflection of me. And how's my child behaving as well? And so I think that is one thing our parents really focused on, as where they were trying to um like contain their needs. It was like it would taught also family secrecy, like what we are dealing with, what we're struggling with stays at home.
Mm.
And we are not showing it to the world. So though we may
Yeah.
have our own family struggles, we're not showing it to the world. And so it also created this piece of like a perfectionism, like that we have to be perfect and we're going to ignore any imperfections. We're not going to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, I spun off in little areas there, but it's different pockets.
Yeah, no, that resonates. The perfectionism for sure. And that, the disconnect that creates in terms of what true living is, I guess. And I like my business, I named it Awaken to Life because I feel like we're asleep to a lot of the realities of what life really is. And it's not just this concept of perfection, of mega success and mega happiness all the time. I think life is more complex than that. And I want to make sure that I'm passing down to my children that it's going to be hard and it's not going to be perfect. And that's okay. Like, it's okay. You can release some of the pressure that you have on yourself. But I have to model that, like you mentioned earlier. Modeling is so key and important. And so I think just in general, I wanted to have this conversation about enoughness because I feel like, especially as women, maybe even as Latina women or women of color, we have a lot of pressures on ourselves. We have a lot of fears that we're navigating. Um, and can we give ourselves permission to set down some of that pressure and just be with whatever is happening, whether it be good or bad, right? Negative or positive, whether that be happiness or sadness or anger or frustration. Like, it's okay to just be with what is, and to give our lives the presence it deserves, give our lives the being mindful, to being intentional, um, be patient with ourselves. Like I wonder if we're starting to lose some of those things just because of even just the nature of the world today with everything's fast, everything's go, 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 everything's like the next thing and the next thing. And we're losing our ability to be patient, to slow down, to just be with what is. And I worry about my children that am I modeling that enough? But it's a constant, again, giving myself permission to do that. So, any final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with in terms of this topic in general, or advice on how to navigate just some of those fears that we have around enoughness.
I actually love what you just said right now, the about around permission. Like I think I
Mm,
want to highlight or re-highlight that what you just said, like giving yourself permission to just be. We definitely live in a fast-paced world. We definitely live in a capitalist world where it's always about you need something else. You need to do better. When yes, there's always space for growth, but how are you practicing gratitude in the moment and giving yourself
mm,
gratitude for just being right now and connecting? Um, again, I want to go back to like for myself, when I think about like one of our family core values is listening to each other and modeling that for our daughter and helping her feel heard, helping
yeah.
present with her. Yes, she needs all those other things. If it was up to her, she would live on marshmallows and chocolates, and we know that she needs food, and we will take care of those things, making sure that she's getting her sleep, eating, and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, her way of communication is um playing and being involved in conversations. And so I giving myself to permission that I can't do that. I'm not going to forget to feed her.
Mm,
And even if she eats an hour late sometimes, like
mhm.
it's okay because I think about I'm so focused on routines and I know routines are important for children, but so is flexibility.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be too rigid. So
Yeah.
permission for you to be colorful and to look outside of those regular expectations.
Color outside the lines,
Yeah,
right?
color outside the lines. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I like that. It's being adaptable, like you mentioned, being flexible. And yeah, play. There's something that you said around play in particular. Our children are already very intuitive and they're already connected to that part of themselves that is tapped into creativity and play and being open and the exploration piece. And as we get older, I think we begin to lose a lot of those qualities in ourselves. And so, how might you orient to being a parent um, through the lens of exploration? How might you orient to being a parent through the lens of play and creativity? And how might that color the way that you parent, the way that you see yourself as a parent? If you gave yourself that permission to not just the structured parenting that we're taught is the rules that we need to play, but outside of that scope as well. So, did you have something that you wanted to
No, I was
add?
just gonna add on with the play, just made me think about it. Or think about like and playing like not overthinking
Yeah,
playing creativity. Again, remembering just to be, follow, and when it comes to play, follow your child's guidance with that.
yeah, yeah,
It doesn't have to be this perfect play. Like, do we have all the right toys for this right now? Or even if we're doing art, do we have all the art things that exist out there? Like art could literally be paper and a crayon. Like it
yeah.
doesn't have to be the box of 100 and something crayons or whatever it is. Because I know, and I say this, I'm saying it to myself because sometimes I get caught up on that. Like I think you and I
Same.
had talked about outside of this around like Pinterest. Like I will go quickly look on Pinterest, like, do I know how to do this art activity? With that, I was like, she's at school. She'll do a great art activity at school. If I come up with something great, if I can't, I am taking away from being present. Um,
Yeah,
so play really for that. It's let your child be the teacher when it comes to play.
yeah. Yeah, and I remember when we were prepping, we talked a little bit about this fallacy that we fall into where we're over structured and we're over disciplined at times. And we don't make room for that flexibility. And so we sometimes like, all right, bedtime is at this time. And, reading, we have to do this at this time. And that it's okay to occasionally step out of those rules and step out of that structure. That it doesn't mean that we're living our lives that way. It's just that we have a wild night sometimes, and
Yeah.
that's okay. It's fun to have an occasional wild night, or they, go to bed past their bedtime. That's no biggie. So yeah, just the permission in that is really key and important for us as human beings too, right? It's that doesn't just relate to parenting, but in every area of our lives. So I guess I wanted to just close with you maybe even talking a little bit about your practice, how people can find you, or the work that you're doing, anything that you want to highlight in particular so that people can follow your work.
To find me, so I'm on Instagram and I have a website. So website is embracecorazon.com. So the full name of my practice is Embrace Corazon Counseling. Again, that website is embracecorazon.com. And then we are also on Instagram under like embrace, it might be hyphenated, Corazon.
Okay. So they can, I'm sure, Google you and see all the
Yes,
links
yes.
related, yeah, to your work. And then so I have awakentolife.com. That's my website. And I do a lot of work when it comes to presence and the slowing down and breathing and getting in touch with your intuition. So I feel like you do a lot of the same in terms of like getting people in touch with that part of themselves. And we'll be doing a lot more collaborations. So I'm sure if anyone's interested and follow my channel, they'll see a whole lot more of Susie. So thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast with me. And yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you again for having me.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us and for listening to the conversation that I had with Susie today. I hope that the conversation resonated for you. I hope that, you were able to jot down some notes and some lessons and some key takeaways as you think about this topic of enoughness and how that relates to you in your own life. And I would ask that you please give us feedback. I'd love to know if there was a topic that we touched on that we didn't quite go deep enough into that you'd like for myself to explore, or for Susie and I to dive into. I will be inviting other folks to the conversation with me, and I'm happy to find some knowledge experts and people out there who have a wide breadth of experience and expertise that they can bring to the conversation. So, if there's a specific topic that you feel particularly called to learn more about, or even just to listen to a new perspective, I'd love to hear your feedback. And then also, I will be linking the socials for both myself and for Susie in the show notes or in the description. So please feel free to check that out. And I ask that you allow yourself to soak in the sun, whatever that may mean to you. Soak in the light, soak in the goodness, soak in that energy that gives you hope, that lets you explore and feel like there's a lot of good and possibility available, because it's easy to get sucked into kind of that negative whirlwind of energy that says this is how things are and how they're going to remain. And I like to think that we're all co-creating this experience together, and we need some light as well. We need some sunshine. So I hope you got a little bit of sunshine by joining me today, and I welcome you to follow my channel and dive in with me. So thank you so much, and I wish you all the best as you navigate the week ahead. Take care.